Hello and welcome to the Tifo Football Podcast. I'm Joe Devine and today I was joined by loads of people. Firstly, I speak to Alex Stewart about Dele Alli, where exactly he fits into the Tottenham team and what's behind his recent resurgence. Giovanni Lo Celso, hugely popular at Spurs. How can Tottenham extract the best out of him? And also defensive problems. I ask Alex, why does this side concede so many goals and why are the individual players so prone to making mistakes? Secondly, I spoke to Pitt-Brooke and Charlie Eccleshare to give me an update on the wage deferral negotiations going on at the moment and the suggestion that some of the players already felt undervalued beforehand, which is complicating the post-COVID situation. We also talk about Eric Dyer, who was finally charged on Friday morning for the game against Norwich where he entered the crowd at the end. We talk about what the likelihood of punishment is here and whether there are any precedents for this happening before. And we talk about Tanguy and Ndombele. What's the situation between him and Mourinho? And is there a suggestion that he might leave the club? Jack and Charlie don't think so. And finally, I spoke to Seb Stafford-Bloor a little bit about the Tottenham Hotspur Supporters Trust and their role in the reversal of the furloughing decision, and also the effects of the last few months on the fan base, not just the furloughing, but the public failures to adhere to social distancing regulations. Aurier and Sissoko are the latest, but Davinson Sanchez and Ndombele and Mourinho have all been busted at one point or another. Anyway, that's today's bumper-packed Spurs episode. Hopefully by the end of it, we will have answered what is going on at Tottenham Hotspur. If you would like to answer that question in significantly more detail, you should take us up on our offer of a 90-day free trial to The Athletic, where you can read Jack and Charlie's work, amongst numerous other journalists, sniff around for the latest scoop, and generally read the highest quality football writing on the internet by the greatest ever team of football writers assembled. That's theathletic.co.uk/Tifo 90. That's the numbers 90 for a 90-day free trial. Thanks for downloading today's episode. You can leave us positive feedback in the form of a comment or a rating. Or you can tweet at us your appreciation. I always like it when you do that. Anyway, that's enough from me. And now here's quite a lot of Alex, followed by a fair bit of Jack and Charlie, and then a touch of Seb. Let's talk about Dele Alli first, because under Jose Mourinho, Dele Alli has seen a bit of a resurgence. I read recently a piece that Tom Werville wrote in The Athletic, Alex, all about where, it was a co-byline obviously, but Tom's part was all about where Dele Alli's best position is. We've seen him play in a number of different positions for Spurs under Pochettino and Mourinho, and for the latter part, that is more to do with injuries, we know, than just where Dele Alli performs best. But there are some general concerns around him based on the idea that he was performing much better when he first joined the club. What's the situation there? Why has there been a resurgence now, and why was there a drop-off in the first place?
So the first thing to say is that the drop-off is quite possibly just because he started sort of fantastically well. I mean, he was outperforming his XG and his XA, expected goals, expected assists, by quite a margin in those first two seasons after he joined from Milton Keynes Dons. So it's quite natural that he would, what statisticians say, regress to the mean, i.e., he would start producing expected goals and expected assists at roughly the rate that you would expect, or rather his goals tally would match his XG rather than outperform it significantly. So it's not like, the drop-off has been enormous and he's all of a sudden a rubbish player. He started on a really hot streak. However, there is clearly an issue with Dele Alli that he has become one of these players who sort of fits into the system around where other people are. You mentioned, for example, the injury issues that Spurs have had this season, and that's seen Dele Alli play as a kind of de facto striker, which is not his best position. It's very clear when the ball is played into him, for example, if he's tightly marked, he'll look for a safe pass backwards because what he wants to do is to find space. that space will allow him either to carry the ball forwards at pace, driving towards defenders, or it will allow him the opportunity to thread a pass through to somebody else. And his best moments as a centre forward towards the end of this season were when he was able to drop really deep and have runners coming from deeper positions past him, and then he could thread the ball through to them, kind of like a false nine. The issue with Dele Alli really is that his ability is predicated on how other people play around him and how they create space for him. But because of the issues that Spurs have had with injury and also having lots of attacking players, Dele Alli has kind of been fitted in around them. So the worst thing for him, really, considering what his best position is and how he best operates.
And under Mourinho, as you said, we've seen a little bit of a resurgence. What can that be down to? Because also there have been a number of injuries which have forced him to play in differing positions. You talk about him in a script upcoming for a video release on Friday that as best as possible he shouldn't be used in the number 9 position, for example, in place of Kane.
No, I think that's true. He is at his best when he's in the centre of the pitch in the 10 position. And there's a very simple reason for this. It's because Dele Alli thrives when he has space. So that can be space to carry the ball into and drive towards opposition players, or it's space to find a pass. Now, when you're in the 10 role, acting as a kind of shadow striker or a Raumdeuter, which is an expression that we use sometimes to do with Thomas Müller, but there are other players that sort of fit into that. When you're central, there are at least 3 other players around you in a 4-2-3-1 who are making those runs, who are attracting opposition defenders, and who are creating space for you. So you've got a striker ahead of you, and you've got wide players either side. Now, those wide players will make runs that will attract the fullback and leave space between the fullback and the centre-back in that channel. That's somewhere that he can attack. Or the striker will be marked, and then he can play in the space between the lines, and that basically allows him the opportunity to do what he does best. When he's playing as a striker, he's generally speaking, he's the furthest player forwards, unless he drops off for runners in behind. That means it's very easy for him to be marked, because you can have a centre-back picking him up, staying on his shoulder. And that's why you see these kind of simple passes into Dele Alli. He plays the ball backwards. What he's looking to do is then run in behind. But generally speaking, he's not as good on the turn. What he wants is to be able to receive the ball with space in front of him. He's much, much more effective when he's either positioned sort of facing the touchline or facing forwards, because then it's quicker for him to turn and start driving towards the opposition. So when you play him as a striker, you negate that ability.
Okay. And can we talk about his ability to game influence as well? This is something that Tom Worthall also brought up in his article, but it's an interesting one. We spoke to Seb about this before we were recording, and Seb noted that actually some of Dele Alli's most impressive moments, or some of his finest goals, have come in games where he actually hasn't had that much influence beyond the goal. Now, what is his ability to influence a game? Because one might describe him as a game changer for that reason, not a player who has a consistent influence over the entirety of a game, although sometimes that will be the case, but more often than not, a player who might pop up for vital moments, despite his broader performance not being necessarily viewed as quite as positive.
Yeah, so this season he has seen an upsurge in the number of chances that he's creating for other players and the XG coming from those chances. So he's not a selfish player. He does exist within a system and work well for others. But I think Seb's point is very valid, because again, it's about going under the radar. When Dele Alli is able to sort of drift around the pitch and find these pockets of space, it's largely because the other players are doing the work for him. They're attracting the opposition markers, they're making runs, they're working hard, and Spurs have had consistently good players at doing this. You know, Harry Kane will attract markers, Son Heung-min makes dynamic runs, Lucas Moura, Eric Lamela, whoever you've got playing in those sorts of positions are going to draw opposition defenders towards them. And what Dele Alli is then able to do is, when he has the right moment where he's in space, there's room for him to run, there's room for him to find the pass, he will suddenly produce that one thing that other players who aren't of his quality are unable to do. So by default, almost, he's at his best when no one's paying attention to him. And when no one's paying attention to him, it's probably because he's not consistently involved in build-up. Again, this is one of the issues when you play him as a striker. He has to be involved in build-up because he's the furthest player forward. If he has somebody playing ahead of him and he has players either side of him, then he can kind of drift slightly away from that build-up, away from those quick interchanges of passes until he finds the right moment where he's not man-marked, he's not covered, and then he can suddenly do something that frees everybody else up, or carry the ball towards the goal and shoot or pass and do something that changes the nature of the game.
Do you know, perhaps this is too broad a point to make, but it reminds me a little bit of when Wayne Rooney had to make the transition from being a very young and surprising player to being constantly marked. You know, and that I remember watching United at the time, and that taking, I would say, a good 2 to 3 years for him to fully adjust to being marked all the time as the best player on the team. And I think, you know, he had to adapt his game, and he had to find ways where he could work in a smaller space, where he could pass the ball off more quickly, and also having obviously Ronaldo around particularly helped that because he was a big draw too. This sort of occurred again when Ronaldo left, I remember, and perhaps one way of explaining the sort of one thing behind the hot streak that Dele Alli was on when he first joined Spurs is that he came from MK Dons, right? He was young. He, you know, obviously the opposition knew that he was a dangerous player, but Spurs, as you just attest to, is full of incredibly talented attacking players. Dele Alli might not be the first name on the list to mark. So maybe because he was quite so effective, he suddenly attracted more attention. I wonder if there's a difference in the way that opposition teams are marking him, and if he's in a period of transition where he's learning to adapt his style of play to that, where he doesn't always have the space that he would like.
I think that's certainly part of it. I mean, you know, any player that bursts onto the scene and does what he does is going to attract attention. And
they have that little golden period, don't they, where they can do pretty much everything until everyone else adjusts.
Well, we've talked about this a lot in terms of other things before on the podcast, where, you know, football tactics are essentially the opportunity that a manager takes to address what the other team is doing, and also to try and set his team up to exploit what the opposition aren't doing. And so Dele Alli, probably in that first season, was a largely unknown quantity. I mean, he had been making waves at MK Dons, certainly, but I think
League One.
Yeah, well, the other issue is that positionally he's not incredibly versatile. I don't want to say that he's anywhere near as good as a central midfielder or even a defensive midfielder as he is as an attacking one, but he has enough to be able to play in those positions. And so Pochettino particularly did use him in a variety of different roles. So, you know, there are graphics for this in Tom Warville's piece, but he was a kind of a left inside forward. He was an attacking 10. He was a central midfielder. He was a defensive midfielder. He's played as a striker under Mourinho for injury reasons. What that means is that each time he moves position, given the kind of player he is, who is so dependent on what everybody else is doing to create the space for him, it makes it much, much harder for him to be able to function as effectively because the team needs to adjust. I don't think it's any great surprise that when he was particularly effective as an inside left was when he was playing with Christian Eriksen in the 10 role. Eriksen was the sort of player who would naturally drop off quite a lot and act as a kind of continuity link kind of 10 with central midfield, rather than being one of these very progressive attacking 10s who's almost like a shadow striker. That did create space slightly inside in the 10 channel for Dele Alli to then move inside towards. So, you know, Spurs have issues with balance, right? And we'll come and to talk about this in a minute with their defensive issues, I'm sure, but trying to get a number of good attacking players into effectively the same area in the pitch, when it works well, you know, Spurs play these little interchange passes, everything's quite clustered towards the middle, it can be very, very effective. When that doesn't work, and when there's not the balance in central midfield behind them, then it does leave Spurs quite vulnerable, and it can leave players like Dele Alli looking fairly peripheral, because everybody's occupying the same kind of space, but there isn't the quick progression of movement, or they're not occupying the same space because they're having to fall back and cover and defend because they don't have the central midfield. With Spurs, it's all about balance, and they haven't really got it at the moment.
I'll be curious to see when the front line is back to full fitness, how Dele Alli's numbers do. Maybe we can revisit at that time. On the theme of individual players, can we just take a moment to talk about Giovanni Lo Celso? Obviously, he's hugely popular in amongst the fan base, and I'm just curious to hear from you how to extract the most out of him within this Spurs team. Where should he be playing, and how can the other players support him?
Well, it's tricky because it's not a dissimilar issue to Dele Alli, really. I had a look at some Opta data, and for players who've played over 800 minutes this season, Lo Celso is 31st for chances created per 90, he's 28th for dribbles completed per 90, and he's 16th for successful passes into the final third per 90. So
this is just within the Premier League.
This is within the Premier League, yeah. And so he's in pretty august company for these creative numbers. However, it's not a dissimilar problem to Dele Alli because, you know, Lo Celso is really, I think, probably best as a 10. He's best as the sort of the player who is prodding the ball into dangerous areas, who's looking to then move up and support attacks. He's got a bit more of a passing range about him, maybe, and a bit more of a drive than Ali, who is more of a natural second striker who's going to appear in the box and score chances for you. But cramming players of that nature in together, again, is the sort of problem that Spurs have. You know, when Son Heung-min and Harry Kane are both back and fit, it seems very difficult to see how there would be room for Dele Alli and Lo Celso in the same team, particularly if Lo Celso is being asked to play further back in a double pivot, but not alongside a natural screening midfielder. He seems to be a sort of, you know, we've talked before about like the 8-10 hybrid, the sort of Kevin De Bruyne, David Silva type of player who is not a pure central midfielder and is not a pure attacking midfielder, but sits somewhere in between those two, without the same level of defensive responsibility that you'd assign an 8, but without playing all the time as far forward as you'd expect a 10 to. And he's a really good player. Like he's going to be excellent. When he arrived from Real Betis, people were very, very excited. But again, how do you accommodate that within the overall balance of a Spurs team? At the moment, it seems like, you know, perhaps the best way of getting something out of Lo Celso is playing a midfield 3, but then it's a lot harder to find room for Dele Alli. If you're playing Dele Alli as a 10, you're going to ask Lo Celso possibly to play as a wide left. I don't think you get the best out of him there. And also then that's where Son plays, right? That's where Son plays, or you play Lo Celso further back, in which case you need to adjust the balance. So maybe some sort of a midfield diamond is the most effective thing. If you have Harry Kane and Son Heung-min playing together, but with Son drifting wide, Dele Alli occupying the 10 space and pushing forwards as an attacker, and then Lo Celso on the left-hand side of what's effectively a midfield 3. In order to do that, though, you do need to have this kind of screening defensive presence that all of the great Mourinho teams have had, and that is where Spurs, I think, really need to look in the transfer market. Yeah, okay. Well, speaking of defensive problems, Spurs have some. It appears that many of their individual players are quite prone to making mistakes at the moment. What's the reason for that, and what's the remedy, Alex? Well, they are making mistakes. I mean, again, according to Opta, for errors leading to goals this season, Spurs are joint third with 7. And for errors leading to shots on goal, they're actually second with 20. Now, some of those errors are genuine kind of individual clangers, like Hugo Lloris dropping the ball over the line when he injured his elbow. But I think, again, what you see is a systematic problem. There are several things that Spurs are trying to contend with at the moment. One of them is a backline that is not quite as physically at its peak as it was. Davinson Sanchez is a hell of an athlete, but Alderweireld, Vertonghen, they are dropping off slightly. Eric Dyer's never been especially quick. What that means is that back line is falling further and further closer to its goal. And this is why Spurs have conceded so many shots. They're fifth in the Premier League for the number of shots conceded. That's because there is a big space in front of the back line because they're dropping deeper and deeper, and they don't have this screening covering midfielder. And that means that teams that are particularly quick on the break, someone like RB Leipzig, as they showed in a recent Champions League game, will be able to find loads and loads and loads of space to run at that back line as they're retreating. If you then throw in a couple of issues like Eric Dyer not being able to find especially good distance on his clearances, which led to goals against RB Leipzig and against Burnley recently, if you look at the fact that the fullbacks are being encouraged to go forwards to provide width, particularly when Spurs are playing a three at the back formation, but they're not then getting back to cover. This was something that Burnley exploited regularly on Spurs' right-hand side, with Dwight McNeil having a very, very good game, being able to get 1-2s to create overlaps. There are systemic issues as much as there are player personnel issues. But to me, it all again stems from this balance. Spurs are lacking the sort of defensive midfielder who can cover across, who can mop those things up, who can allow the back line to play slightly more on the front foot, who can cover in behind the fullbacks if the fullbacks get caught out of position. And Spurs don't have those things. And so these individual errors are arising as a result of them having systemic issues rather than just these are overnight bad players.
Well, I've given you no forewarning of this, but who would you buy to play in that shielding defensive midfield role? Or not necessarily who should Spurs buy, but who's a really good example of a player playing somewhere, whether or not they would fit at Spurs or move to Spurs? Who are we talking about?
So we're talking about players like, I would say in the Premier League, one of the really great examples at the moment is Wilfred Ndidi. Marvellous Nakamba at Aston Villa, who is playing in a very poor Villa side, who are actually first for both errors leading to goals and errors leading to shots on goal. But Nakamba is basically trying to do the defensive work of about three people. We have been looking recently at young players for an upcoming video series. Florentino at Benfica would fit that mould. It's the sort of guy who is able to do the dirty work, who will mop up, who is energetic. You don't want somebody who's awful at passing, because clearly there's a kind of recycling element involved in that. But players like Konrad Laimer at RB Leipzig, who is probably the best pressing midfielder in the world at the moment. Somebody of that nature. The issue that Spurs have is that these sorts of players have increasingly come to realise their value in the market. So, when you had someone like Makelele, his importance wasn't necessarily recognised. I think N'Golo Kante's performance for Leicester in their title-winning season was a real step change in how people saw and valued incredibly good defensive midfielders.
Maybe Kante is available given the situation at Chelsea.
Possibly, although I think the issues that Chelsea would have, particularly within their fan base, but also it's hard to see with Chelsea because they play Jorginho in that kind of Pirlo role, the quarterback role. You do need to have those players either side, and I think Chelsea's midfield balance with Kovacic as the player who carries the ball, drives forwards, releases passes. You can have Mason Mount doing that as well. You can even have Ross Barkley doing that. And then Jorginho and then Kante on the other side, able to kind of sweep up and do the defensive work and cover as well as get forward. I think Chelsea would be mad to upset that balance.
Okay.
Also, I don't think Spurs would want Chelsea would want to buy from sell to Spurs. You've got that kind of London thing going on, haven't you? They'd be more inclined to take a bid from abroad or possibly even from another Premier League club.
Okay, so Charlie, I wondered if you could give us a bit of an update on the wage deferral negotiations. It's very interesting read that you contributed recently on The Athletic that suggests that some of the players are actually a little bit timid in this area because there's a suggestion that they already felt undervalued before this situation. Can you just clarify what that means and what this means for the furloughing situation going forwards? The deferral of wages going forwards.
Yeah, sure. So there have been tensions going back a few years amongst some of the players, feeling like they didn't quite get maybe the raises or the rewards they were expecting. I think the first time this surfaced was after the 2016-17 season, when Spurs finished second with 86 points and had a pretty amazing season and didn't really then get much in the way they felt in recognition. Some players as well felt similar after the Champions League final last year, although they did get pre-agreed bonuses and I think some additional things then as well. And so that sense of, well, we've maybe been a bit undervalued in the past, and so now you want to do us a favour, now you want us to do a favour kind of thing, is a sentiment that I've been told some of the players feel. Now, obviously, for every club, these negotiations are extremely complex, and that's why very, very few have actually agreed anything concrete, because you're trying to make an agreement based on a group of people who all have extremely different situations. On a really basic level, you've got a guy like Japhet Tanganga who's in the first team squad playing pretty regularly on around £1,000 a week. Then you've got someone like Harry Kane and Tanguy Ndombele who are on £200,000 a week. So right there you can see coming up for an agreement that satisfies everyone from top to bottom is difficult. Throw in the fact that, people have different situations with who they have relying on them or whatever. So it's complicated anyway. And that layer of it, that sense of being undervalued, is quite an interesting additional layer. And that's something a bit more specific to Tottenham, whereas I think those other things are fairly universal across the board.
Can I first say, when we hear numbers like 20% coming out of Arsenal as it relates to wage cuts or wage deferrals, would that be across the board? So if that were to apply to Tottenham hypothetically, does that mean Tanganga is taking the same sort of percentage pay cut as Harry Kane would be, or is there a situation that could be resolved differently where it was personalised to each employee?
I mean, I guess you could do it differently so that different players have different amounts. It just gets quite messy and quite complicated, and that may be the best solution so that you're not putting people in a position that they don't feel comfortable with, but it's just fiendishly difficult finding a way that satisfies everyone, and also everyone's going to have had different experiences. So if some players might feel they've been undervalued previously, well, others aren't necessarily going to feel that way. That's going to be, again, a very specific thing. So I don't know, I feel like you could try and customize it a bit more, but in what is already a pretty difficult situation to navigate, that adds a layer of complexity that some might want to avoid, but I guess everything's on the table at this point.
So the last time you guys were on, we were talking about Spurs as a club, and Daniel Levy in particular as an exec that approached the finances of football in a very sort of strict and sensible way. And we spoke about a piece that you wrote. This was, maybe back in January, it might even be before Christmas now, about how Spurs have managed to tie their more talented players down to long-term contracts, which just sort of keep renewing every year with slight wage bumps. And they've managed to build this incredible squad with comparatively little by way of a wage bill. It felt at the time that sort of tactic had started to be noticed and started to be recognised for what it was by the players. And we had situations with Eriksen and Alderweireld, I remember, who suddenly were thinking, actually, I'm not going to re-sign a contract. I can see what's happening here and maybe potentially want to move somewhere else, or I'm going to stick around for more money, for example. Do you think this situation with the botched furloughing job, the current wage deferrals, and what I was just speaking about, does that summarise Tottenham now as a club that maybe are letting loose a little bit in that regard, that maybe we can't describe as the most financially or fiscally sensible club in the Premier League anymore? Do you know what I mean?
I think what we've seen recently is that Daniel Levy's traditional approach to contracts is falling apart. I mean, that's the only conclusion really to draw from them having to sell Christian Eriksen for about 20 million euros, which is far less than what they wanted for him a while before. They only did that because he successfully said no to those contract offers for a while, and that meant that they had no option but to sell him to get anything out of him. They had to give Toby Alderweireld probably a bigger deal than they would normally give to a player of his age and his position, which again shows that they can't really stick to the old principles in the same way. And we don't know exactly what's going to happen, but they're probably going to lose Jan Vertonghen on a free. I think that's like the likeliest outcome, although they could, I suppose, still retain him if he chooses to sign. So I think that the old Spurs approach over the course of this season has come under more pressure than it ever has done before, and that has made it hard. It's made it harder for Daniel Levy to keep those plates spinning at the same time, which is what he did before. And now clearly, what's happening? The realities of coronavirus are putting a whole new set of pressures on the financial management of the club, which he would never have anticipated. Like, nobody would have anticipated that the new stadium would open and then a year later would get shut, and they wouldn't be able to have all these games and lucrative concerts and NFL matches and everything there. So it's been, what was already a delicate balance is now under more pressure than anybody could ever have expected.
I suppose, you touch on the point there. Daniel Levy could never have foreseen these circumstances, but if we're to look at the way that the Tottenham sort of contracts approach has worked in the past, would it now, given that it seems to be falling apart, could we now retrospectively categorise it as a bit of a failure, or would we say that because it worked so well for such a long period of time and enabled Spurs to build the team that it had, finishing second in the league and reaching the Champions League final, it was a success, and this is just a natural byproduct of how football clubs are run? We need to move on.
I'd say it was definitely a success. They finished. They should have won the league. Like, they finished second. They were the best team in the country, give or take, over a sort of 2-year time span. And they did that, spending as much money on players as Everton do. They did. They've always had a Europa League wage bill, and despite having a Europa League wage bill, they managed to overachieve. Now, obviously, you can argue that is certainly more down to Mauricio Pochettino than Daniel Levy, but Levy was the one who put the financial plan together. The problem is that kind of plan was never going to be, look, we've talked about this before, but that kind of plan was never going to work forever, because eventually players get older, their priorities change, their mentality changes, they have different expectations, and then you have to change. You can't operate in the same way anymore. But I certainly think that approach was a brilliant approach, which was perfect for the time, the time it was used in.
It was also, I agree. I think it has to be seen as a success, and finish it, getting to the Champions League final whilst at the same time making more in profits than any other Premier League club is extraordinary, really. They didn't buy a player throughout the season where they then, got to the Champions League final, and it's not like they'd spent a fortune before. The thing is, you're always, for that to work, you have to get in a manager who's outstanding and it clicks, and they obviously had that in Pochettino, but there is a finite period, as we saw, that nowadays in modern football any manager really can stay at a club, and that probably is around what Poch did, unless he completely revamps the squad, and that was financially just out of the question. So yeah, to a degree you are going to be at the mercy of a couple of absolutely outstanding individuals, but I think that's kind of fair enough. There's no other way to do it. For them to be competing with Man City and clubs like that is actually pretty amazing when you step back and think about it.
Can I ask you guys about Eric Dyer, who, as we remember, famously climbed into the crowd at the end of the game with Norwich and climbed over, 15, 20 rows of seats to talk to his brother after the man who was confronting him had flown the stadium, you could put it. He was charged the other day, right? So what's the situation now? I just want to bring people up to date, because I think there was some conflicting feelings around that. I remember Mourinho at the time saying that he was in support of the player, that obviously he'd done something that he shouldn't have, but at the same time he's done something that probably everyone in his situation would have done. And as a result of the current situation with the pandemic and everything else that's happening with football, it's sort of flown under the radar a little bit. But can you just update us on what's happening with that situation?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, he's been given a misconduct charge, and then from there, he is able to, give a response, and then the FA will decide on a punishment. It could be a fairly lengthy ban because it is quite a serious offence. I think it's a really interesting one because at the time, I don't think there was a huge amount of condemnation for Dyer. I mean, obviously people were saying we can't condone it, etc., but I think it was quite a human reaction to a situation that most people can, to a degree, empathise with, and that's what Mourinho was kind of touching on. I think in the hierarchy of offences by players, it didn't score that highly, partly because for some it felt commendable is too far, but there was a bit of honour, and I think it was just quite a human reaction. It wasn't he did something really stupid. He didn't post a video on Snapchat or something like that. Do you know what I mean? So I think it might be, to a degree, with a heavy heart is maybe overstating it, but he probably will get he'll get a suspension of some sort. Because they can't, the FA can't be seen to condone a player storming up seats and confronting someone. That is potentially very, very dangerous.
I was going to say, is there any precedent in this case?
I mean, Eric Cantona was the one, when we were there, that was the one that came to mind. Obviously very different, but kung fu kicking a spectator, that was what we started thinking about. But yeah, I mean, it's hugely unusual, to the point that when we saw it happening, we kind of heard a kerfuffle from our seats. We could vaguely see it, but I don't think we could really quite believe it or make sense of it. It just didn't really seem possible. I don't know if that was your memory, Jack.
It was weird. It was one of those situations where we didn't know what was happening, and then the first time that we got any sense there was something going on was when you saw hundreds of Spurs fans all with their phones out filming something. Yeah. Now that doesn't really happen normally, but then when you saw all these Spurs fans who turned around facing into the crowd with their phones out, my immediate reaction was, must be a celebrity Spurs fan, like Michael McIntyre. as if the mere presence
Zac Efron is here.
The mere presence of Michael McIntyre would be enough to get all these Spurs fans to turn around and start taking photos, which would be odd given that he would have been there for the 120 minutes plus penalty kicks anyway. But then eventually, you kind of think, well, it probably is more serious than that. And then I think it was seeing a tweet. That is often how you get clarity on these things. Even when you're in the stadium, you need somebody to tweet about it before you actually realise. But it was weird. It was really weird. And also, I mean, I do remember there was a rumour going around on social media that Dyer was jumping in to defend Jedson Fernandez from racist abuse. Now, that didn't turn out to be the case, but there was an hour or so between the incident and finding out from Spurs officials exactly what had happened, that we were thinking, oh God, how awful, there's been another instance of racist abuse. And you would naturally think back to the Antonio Rudiger alleged incident just before Christmas. So yeah, it was a sort of strange moment to report upon, and it took us a while to piece together precisely what had happened. But it was all very odd.
I mean, presumably, if there is no real precedent, then the FA will have to treat this as the precedent, right? I mean, that what we might be able to infer from the ban that this is an attempt to either stop people doing this in the future, or at least to point towards when there does need to be a further ban in the future. You said it might be a lengthy ban, Charlie. What are we talking about lengthy? Because I know you also mentioned Eric Cantona, which was 9 months. We know it's not going to be that, but no. What does a lengthy ban mean?
No, well, also they'd have to do it in game terms rather than months, wouldn't they? Because right now you could
a good time to get a month ban.
Yeah, I remember my brother actually in Sunday League got a 12-week ban, but it was over the summer, so it was entirely pointless. It was also very harsh, but anyway, I'll save that for the Football Cliches podcast. Yeah. I mean, a few games probably. Certainly, it will be interesting to see how much of a ban he gets compared with, say, Dele Alli, who, again, it feels crazy, but Dele still hasn't had the verdict delivered on what he's going to get, whether it's a ban or a fine or whatever, for the video he posted on Snapchat. And there is a feeling that based on precedent there, he'll probably get a suspension as well. But I don't know. I don't know what people think is worse and how you quantify that.
Yeah, fair enough. Hey, can we chat about Tanguy and Ndombele for a moment? And I would like to start by just asking you guys, what is the situation with Ndombele and Mourinho? I'm sure that the Spurs fans listening will be very au fait, but for those of us who are supporters of other clubs or have not paid attention, what's the problem here?
Well, they're kind of philosophically polar opposites, I guess. I mean, they're not a natural match. I mean, the idea of Mourinho actively wanting to sign Ndombele is one that's difficult to imagine. So if you think Ndombele is this mercurial, quite languid in his approach, but with moments of genius, those types of players is not really what you think about, what Mourinho looks for, certainly in a central midfielder. So there have been tensions for a while, and it's all, there have been issues where Ndombele felt he wasn't fit to play. Mourinho talked about this publicly. There was a big kind of ideological split amongst the fan base of people saying, well, Mourinho's absolutely right to do that, and Ndombele is not good enough, with others saying, give the guy a break, he's injured, and you shouldn't be throwing him under a bus. Anyway, it kind of rumbled on for a few months, and then at the Burnley game, Mourinho hooked him at half time and came out and just went for him in his post-match press conference. Again, it divided the fan base, though I think more by this point were actually pro Jose, which was interesting, because I think there was a sense that Ndombele wasn't working hard enough. Now, what's interesting is that Mourinho doesn't see it, or I think the way he would position it is it's not an adversarial thing. Like, he views it as he's desperate to get the best out of Ndombele, and he sees this as the best way to do it. This is the confrontational leadership that we've spoken about before. But it's just very divisive, and I think a lot of people think that this isn't the best way to get,
I mean, it didn't really work with Luke Shaw, did it?
No, I mean, but but then there are some players like Joe Cole who it did work well with. He, would take him off at half time, gave him quite a hard time, and then obviously the plot thickened in in what would ordinarily be quite comical circumstances. If it weren't for the fact that there's a global pandemic and breaking the rules is not a smart thing to do, but him organising this one-on-one session with Ndombele in the park was, just bizarre, and obviously the context of everything that's gone before it. But again, this does tie into the idea that from Mourinho's point of view, he saw that as helping the player out, giving him, one-to-one tuition, as it were.
Did he though? Because this is Jose Mourinho we're talking about. This is a man who models himself in some ways after Alex Ferguson, in that everything that he says to the press is it has a subtext and theoretically has a meaning, right? I mean, I remember seeing those pictures of Ndombele and Mourinho in a public park training, and thinking, what is Mourinho getting out of this? He's a smart man. He knows that people are going to see him. Why does he want the world to see that Ndombele needs extra training? Could that fit in again to the idea of hooking him at half time, trying to encourage him, or trying to get his back up and get him to feel he has a point to prove?
Yeah, possibly. Or it is just him feeling that showing that he is really trying to get the best out of him is also important. But yeah, I mean, it was very strange. But I mean, it will be very interesting to see where this goes, because obviously there's a big feeling within the club. They really want this transfer to work. He cost a lot of money. That's the thing. Spurs have not gone out and spent loads traditionally, and Ndombele was a big signing. And for a club like Tottenham, who they're not going to outspend their rivals, they need to get signings like this right. And they have done with guys like Lo Celso, who's been exactly the kind of signing they should be making. Steven Bergwijn, so far so good. So they really want to make this work. And obviously Mourinho knows if he could make it work, that would reflect very, very well on him. But they're not a natural fit, and I think that's why it's quite a compelling narrative and subplot that's run through the season.
I mean, there were reports at the end of last week that Barcelona are looking at Ndombele as well, and that perhaps as part of some kind of player swap deal, which we know are potentially more likely to happen in higher numbers this summer as a result of the way that the transfer market will be impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. Is this likely to happen, do you think? I mean, I realise that you just said that Spurs are very, very keen for Ndombele to work out, but if push were to come to shove with, if that situation were to sort of worsen between Mourinho and Ndombele, who would the club back, and is it possible at all that he could leave?
I think Daniel Levy would be really reluctant to let the player go. Daniel Levy, Ndombele's his record signing. Like he's never spent as much money on any player before, and I don't think he would be willing to write off any loss on him unless he was very confident he was getting somebody better in return. It'd be interesting to see whether Mourinho could persuade him otherwise, because Mourinho is likely to want Ndombele out of the door and some players he can rely on. But you can definitely foresee a bit of tension there, because it's not like Mourinho did, remember, get Abramovich to write off some pretty good players when we were back at Chelsea 5 or 6 years ago. But I don't think Levy would be quite as persuadable as Abramovich was.
Seb, will you tell me about the role of the Tottenham Hotspur Supporters Trust and the reversal of the furloughing decision that we've just been discussing?
I can indeed, Joe. So as everyone knows, on the 31st of March, the club announced their intention to furlough staff, at which point we had 3 solid days of anger. I don't think that's overstating it in any way. I think people were very upset. I think they were very disappointed. I think some people were even a little bit ashamed of the way the football club was acting. The Supporters Trust co-chairs Martin Cloak and Cat Law issued a statement on the 2nd of April saying that they're aware of the club's position. They also wanted to outline their role as a supporters trust, which is to reflect the beliefs of the fans, not to give unilateral decisions or opinions on the way the club is behaving. And they urged a rethink, essentially, of the club's position. 8 days later, on the 10th of April, by which time, importantly, Liverpool had announced that they were going to make the same decision, but then reversed it. Again, probably due to a very similar reaction. Liverpool's intangibles are drawn from a very specific set of social values, which I don't think it's unreasonable to say that the original statement trampled all over, especially with sort of the active marketing slogan of "This means more." I didn't think it was a particularly good look to be caught with a hand in the government's pocket. But Liverpool listened to the fans, they listened to the media's reaction, and they reversed their decision. Tottenham didn't. There was just absolute silence. They had, in their original statement, which importantly was actually released on the same day, they released some very flattering financial results. Pretty terrible optics all round on that day. Tottenham didn't reverse their decision. So on the 10th of April, the club, the trust issued a clarification in which they said, in addition to their first statement, look, we're not against furloughing per se. We're not just issuing a blanket rejection of that, because obviously what's important is people's jobs, people's livelihoods, and their securities. What they took issue with was the communication. So I think maybe what might work, Joe, is if we, with the description on this pod, if we left a little link to that initial statement so people can have some context, that might help. Yeah. It was very blunt. It was very, this is what we're going to do, deal with it. It was very Daniel Levy, essentially. It spoke about how ridiculous it was that the people in the world were talking about transfer speculation and potential new additions to the squad. It was also Tottenham getting ahead of the curve. It was them putting themselves in a position where potentially they could attract the bulk of the ire over it. not just from their own fans, but the football community at large, saying, right, well, why have you, without really clarifying your position or your need to do this, are you instinctively furloughing staff? And furloughing low-paid staff as well. We're talking about non-playing staff, so of course the lowest-paid members of the organisation. So the club said, "Look, we don't have a problem with furloughing the trust. Sorry, we don't have a problem with furloughing. What we want is for the club to walk us through why this has happened. It also wants to stress the importance of executives taking the pay cut first." For context, Daniel Levy's salary is £4 million a year, in addition to which in 2019 he received a £3 million bonus as a result of completing the new stadium. So when you are the highest paid chairman in the Premier League, which is saying something given the context of the Premier League, and then you are right at the head of the queue for government money, that is a very, very difficult, it's a noxious PR problem. And I think the point the Trust wanted to make was that this isn't, whilst in other parts of the world clubs operate as franchises and they are very much businesses first, I think the point the Trust made was that clubs in this country were exactly that in the first instance. They were social institutions, and therefore the way the club behaves reflects on its fan base. Because I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that in the future, and this may well prove the case anyway, in the future, had the club not reversed their decision to ensure that everyone receives 100% of their pay and that the only pay cuts are coming from executives now, then this is the kind of thing that gets sung at fans at away games.
Yeah. No, I think that makes sense. I mean, you're on the key point there, and I think the key point is the one that you make on the Trust's behalf, which is that they're not against furloughing in principle. I mean, what I want to do, if you have a moment, is just for us to briefly compare this to the situation at Norwich. Because obviously Norwich, there was a silence for a long time, and I think, as far as I'm aware, the process of events that occurred there was that the intention to furlough was there with the club pretty early on. It seemed for a while that they had stopped, and they were sort of silently observing what was happening with Spurs and with Liverpool. However, they have since gone ahead with furloughing a number of their non-playing staff. And Stuart Webber spoke to Michael Bailey, and they released this piece in The Athletic just a couple of days ago, actually, sort of explaining why. You know, he describes football clubs as dartboards. This is Stuart Webber, and he also tries to make the point that they pay more sort of tax than they'll be benefiting from here across the course of a year, and also that what they don't want to change what they're doing just for the case of public perception. They're making the case that they need to do this, they can't afford not to, and they're attempting to make the financial case as to why that is true. So they're picking up some criticism because they haven't started talking about wage deferrals with their players yet. They haven't asked their players to take pay cuts or deferrals or whatever, but their point is that we need to wait to see what the financial damage is going to be. They're expecting anywhere between 25 and 35 million pounds loss here. At that point, they'll discuss wage deferrals with their players. Do you think that the case here, and you know, as the Tottenham Supporters Trust said, they're not against furloughing, particularly just in certain circumstances. Do you think there's a difference for Norwich, a Premier League club, but one that has £30 million annual revenue, versus Spurs, or you know, even Manchester United, who have £600 million annual revenue? I'm not sure what Spurs is, but it'll be significantly higher than Norwich is. Do you think there's a difference there, particularly given the way that they're not explaining the reason behind the decision? Yeah,
absolutely. I think the only real commonality is this aversion a lot of football clubs share with actually walking people through their processes. That's the issue. It is I'm going to quote the Trust again. The Trust, the Tottenham Supporters Trust, were not against furloughing. They were against redundancies and loss of revenue. That is the key issue here. Now, how football clubs work their way around it is immaterial if they don't communicate that properly. Without question. Look, let's also add a further layer of context, Joe, because when Tottenham released their financial results, people saw, I think it was a £96 million profit, which is actually, I think, a world record in football. And that's very, very difficult to tally with the approach that they announced a couple of hours later. Having said that, let's remember also that let's think of some of the other firms to utilize the furloughing scheme. So Tesla, for instance. Now, Tesla obviously are associated with Elon Musk, whose wealth I think is somewhere in the region of $20 billion. I think that's accurate as of 2019. Joe Lewis, Tottenham's principal owner, is worth $5 billion. So he's kind of a market trader in relation to someone like Elon Musk, and yet there isn't half the outrage. So that the key is not public relations, but allowing people to understand, because rightly or wrongly, because of the way football has behaved over the last few generations, the public are absolutely entitled to think the worst or to assume the worst in every situation. So diffusing these issues is the first step for anyone, whether you're Tottenham, whether you're Manchester United, or whether you're Norwich.
Yeah, and they haven't done that. And, I listened to Rafa Honigstein, who's going to be on our second podcast this week, actually. He was on the Stahlcast, the Athletics Bundesliga podcast, talking to Mesut Ozil's agent about some of these issues. And what I found very interesting, and obviously we should caveat this with saying that this is from the agent's perspective. So obviously his intention is to look out for the welfare and the best possible outcome for his players, right? But he was I think he was alluding to Arsenal, let's say, around the wage deferrals and the wage cuts situation with players at football clubs. The picture he painted was that if football clubs are going to their players to ask them to take wage deferrals or wage cuts, they should be explaining why and giving some insight as to why that is necessary. Now, that is not to say that the players don't want to do that, don't want to do everything they can to help the other staff, aren't incredibly wealthy, and certainly in the case of Premier League players, and obviously, if for the most part want to do what they can, they will be hugely criticised if they show any sort of opposition to this as well. So there's an element of pressure involved in these situations and the negotiations. And also there's reports of clubs using the head coach or using coaching staff to try and negotiate with the players, which also might add an element of pressure as well. As Mesut Ozil's agent says, if you're a young player, for example, and you might see this connected to your future at the club. But the basic requirement in this case would be to explain why it's necessary. And when you hear about a club like Norwich who are going ahead with furloughing but haven't even had the conversation with their players yet because they admittedly don't know what the outcome is going to be. They don't know how much money they're going to lose because nobody does. How can you then sort of rectify that with what a club like Arsenal does, asking players to take pay cuts? How do they come up with those figures? Under what circumstances do they know that they need that much money, etc.? It all becomes quite muddied, doesn't it? And it runs into the same sort of theme of clubs. I suppose that the total accusation or alleged accusation that Mesut Ozil's agent or any agent might make is that this opportunity is difficult for clubs, as it is difficult for everyone, but it does also present opportunities for clubs to potentially take advantage if they aren't being watched.
Absolutely, Joe. I think one of the key points there is that firstly, this is an unprecedented situation. And secondly, even at the best of times, which these most certainly aren't, football clubs are very opaque. The public are not privy to the decision-making processes. They also don't necessarily understand the dynamic by which, for instance, wage deferrals for players would be agreed. It's not like an ordinary organisation. You cannot make that decision unilaterally. It cannot just be a decree from on high that you are going to take 30% out of someone's wages, because it is in a negotiation. I think a really good example to look to, and as a Tottenham fan, it really does pain me to say this, but Chelsea have handled this extremely well. If you look at the way they have communicated, not just with their fan base, but with the public at large and society around them, then that has been exemplary. I also think one of the other things that you have to factor in is that for people who are not in the UK, Matt Hancock is a government minister, and he's been very vocal, not correctly so, about trying to shift the burden of responsibility onto the shoulders of Premier League footballers, which, given the issues in this country with taxation and the percentage of the super wealthy that Premier League footballers make up, which is negligible at best, you are adding a further complication, a further pressure into a situation which already lacked definition, Joe. And so the best way forward for every club was just to be transparent. I think, just bring it back around to Tottenham, I think one of the shames of this is that the furloughing issue and what ultimately has to be described as a flip-flop disguises some of the good the club have done. So I've got a little list in front of me which I picked out of the the way that the stadium is being repurposed. So at the moment, the media entrance and the cafe has been sort of turned over as a welfare area for visitors and NHS staff. They're treating people in the stadium itself. The NFL away changing rooms are going to be used as a maternal day unit. Not quite sure what that means, but it sounds helpful. The interview rooms in the players' tunnels are going to be used as consultation and scanning rooms. And the away dressing room, the football away dressing room, will be a midwife's clinical room. This is all good stuff. This is all good social responsibility. And yet the lesson is, because you couldn't communicate, because you, as football so often does, because firstly it thought it knew best, and secondly it didn't think it needed to explain itself, no one's really interested in any of that.
Yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it? Just quickly, can you sort of talk about the wider effect on the fan base here, and not just as it relates to furloughing, but also other recent issues? Aurier and Sissoko, Davinson Sanchez and Dembele, Mourinho, all busted at one point or another.
Yeah, mindlessness. I would draw a line between the kind of issues we've described in the last 10 minutes and these ones, because the way the club behaves culturally reflects on the fans. The way players behave is regrettable and indefensible, but ultimately something we all just, we can condemn without feeling any personal responsibility for it. I can't offer any explanation for why these things have happened.
This is social distancing, incidentally, the names that we just mentioned. These are players who fail to adhere to public social distancing regulations. Yeah,
so the first instance was Jose Mourinho organised an ad hoc training session with Tanguy and Dembele, and they went out running, and this is where it gets a little bit vague. At some point, they encountered Davinson Sanchez, who was out on his own little run, and he joined in the training session. And obviously, there are some fairly damning and vivid pictures which show that they are not respecting social distancing policy.
I don't know if you've seen this outside, Seb, but sometimes when I go outside for my daily exercise, which is a very slow walk, by the way, my government-sanctioned incredibly slow walk.
Mine too.
I occasionally walk past people who go, "Oh, hi, fancy seeing you here," as if you haven't set up to meet and make it look like an accident. That's happening all over Crouch End, and I don't mind telling.
Except in Tottenham, or areas near Tottenham, where even after that first controversy, somehow Serge Aurier and Moussa Sissoko managed to commit the same offence a second time a couple of days ago. Let's put this into context, because there are worse things going on. By all accounts, Moise Kean organised a house party over the weekend, which I don't even know where to begin with that. Jack Grealish has broken... I think he attended a party a couple of weeks ago. So it's happening, and people are making mistakes.
What about Kyle Walker? That's my favourite one.
Yeah, well, he's not our problem anymore as a Tottenham fan base.
Was that story true, though?
I don't know, so I'm hesitating.
No, I agree. Let's hesitate, but perhaps it's not true. Yeah, I mean, there was some sort of alleged thing. I don't know if that's the case.
Let's step back from that ledge.
Right away. Yeah. Move away from the Kyle Walker ledge.
Yeah. I think Joe, to be circumspect about this, I think what this has shown is the effect fans can still have on their clubs, because the Supporters Trust have done a wonderful job. I like to say that I know Martin and Kat personally, and I like them, so I'm a little bit biased. However, the fan base as a whole has really stepped up. A lot of people have understood that, unlike a lot of times in football where tribalism kicks in and people will defend their club to the death, irrespective of what they do, there was very little hesitation in the majority saying, this is outrageous, fix this. We will not toe this line. And actually, maybe it's just because the world's a bit of a desperate place at the moment. That's been very heartening. That's been very encouraging to see.
Well, I just want to say that I'm looking at The Guardian right now, and The Guardian have a story that reads, Manchester City are to investigate Kyle Walker over sex party during lockdown. Walker apologises for inviting sex workers to his home. City disappointed and will conduct internal disciplinary. They're disappointed. So The Guardian are saying that I think it's okay for us to say sex party.
Well, we talking on behalf of the Tottenham fan base, I'll say to Manchester City, it's not like you weren't warned about Kyle Walker. So
okay, right. Well, listen, that's all fantastic. Thanks very much, Seb. And we will be back later in this week. I'm going to speak to Rafa Honigstein about just how the Bundesliga plan to start playing football again, which is fascinating, incidentally. And we'll be back next week with another What's Going On At episode, but about a different club. In fact, I might do another Newcastle episode, more about the new prospective owners with James Montague. I think that's a good idea.
That would be great. Look forward to that.
Cool. Okay. Thanks very much for listening, everyone, and we'll hope to see you back here soon. Au revoir.